Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to this webinar on suicide prevention, building safer workplaces and communities. It's brilliant to see so many of you here. I think over 1,000 people have joined, which just reinforces how important suicide prevention in the workplace is. I'm delighted to be here with Chloe and Nick. My name's Simon Blake and I am the Chief Executive of Mental Health First Aid England. I also chair the Support After Suicide Partnership, which is a membership network of organisations that provide specialist bereavement support to people bereaved by suicide. Chloe, do you want to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. I think this is the biggest session I've done, so it's really lovely to virtually see everyone on a Tuesday morning. My name is Chloe. My pronouns are she, her. I am an ambassador for Mental Health First Aid England, and I'm also head of social impact for Lucky Generals, as well as volunteering within community spaces.
Thanks very much, Chloe. And Nick? You're on mute.
Thank you, Simon. That will help. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Nick Barnes. My pronouns are he and him. I am the founder and the executive director of the National Centre for Suicide Prevention, Education and Training in the UK. So suicide prevention education really is my passion. And it's great to have so many people here to talk about, well, the workplace and the role of suicide prevention in the workplace. So yeah, a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. And just before we get started, obviously you have joined a webinar around suicide prevention, and so just to remind yourself really that whilst we're discussing these topics, please look after yourself. We know that sometimes it can become difficult or overwhelming, so please do what you need and look after yourself throughout. If you do want any support, we do have a mental health first aider on the webinar today, so please message privately in the chat and they'll be able to signpost you to relevant support services. The webinar is being recorded and will be shared with you afterwards, so you'll be able to watch back. And then please do put anything in the chat. Obviously, please be mindful about information that you do put in there, but feel free to put things in the chat. We will pick up any themes and think about those, but we'll also have the Q&A section live, so you can put in any questions and answers, and we will make sure that there is time for those at the end of the session. We will have, obviously, your cameras are off and mics please are placed on mute for all attendees. With this many people, it's obviously not possible to have the sort of live interaction, but we will do our best through polls, through the chat and through the Q&A to make sure that it really does feel like something that you're involved in. Now, just before we go on to talk about some of the issues and the questions, the context for this is obviously that it's World Suicide Prevention Day on Saturday. This is a global day, and it's really aiming to raise consciousness around suicide, to highlight efforts that take place globally, and the theme is creating hope through action. And we all have a responsibility and a role to play in raising awareness, in creating understanding and becoming better equipped to prevent suicide and also support those impacted by suicide. And really, we won't do lots of numbers in the session, but we will send you a resource pack which has got some. But just to really emphasise that, suicide is the single biggest killer of men under the age of 45. More than 700,000 people die each year to suicide around the world, and if my memory serves me correctly, it's once every 40 seconds, which is just a really big number. And is why it's so important. That there were almost 5,000 deaths by suicide in England and Wales in 2020, and just over 800 in Scotland. So yeah, it's significant numbers in England and in the UK and globally. And then there are some people who are at increased risk of suicide. Some communities, the inequalities that we see across health and social inequalities also bear out in relation to suicide as well. So in terms of language, if we can just remind ourselves that helpful language obviously normalizes conversations around mental health and removes shame. We use the terms died by suicide, attempted suicide, and suicide thoughts and behaviour in replacement of outdated language. And the most obvious of that is obviously committed suicide. And so it's really, really important that we recognise it isn't a crime, and that we need to use more inclusive and responsible and respectful terms. And I just wanted to get Nick to start us really by talking a bit about language and the importance of language in relation to suicide before we kick off.
Thank you, Simon. It takes me back to maybe 20 years ago in the workplace where culture was very different. And I remember overhearing conversations in the background as we do at work and hearing people talk and thinking at that point how clumsy and unfamiliar and actually harmful some of the language was that I heard then. So this is about avoiding harm and actually being helpful. And as you used that word, inclusivity is very helpful. So we feel a sense of belonging. So language is important. We talk about this in loads of different areas today. Helpfully, it's 20 years on. We've got 20 years of learning behind us around suicide prevention, and culture today is in some workplaces very, very different from where it was at the millennium. So yeah, avoiding causing harm and including people begins with the words that we use. So as far as suicide's concerned, yeah, some of those words that we used back then, we just don't use anymore. Now, I never fail to be surprised when I'm on social media, which is very rare these days. But when I do indulge in social media and I go and look at what's happening on, I don't know, platforms, the only one I seem to use is LinkedIn, I still see language being commonly used in comments. And it's as simple as people don't know that they don't know how to talk about this subject. So, well, there's ways that we can remedy that, and that's part of why we're here today. So, yeah, using language, it starts with the words we say, and knowing what is the correct and what's a helpful way to be able to communicate around suicide prevention, creating healthy workplaces is really helpful. So yeah, we will be modeling healthy language, helpful language for the next 55 minutes, absolutely.
Thanks very much, Nick. And I know, Chloe, that you feel absolutely passionately about the importance of language. I don't know if you have anything that you wanted to add to Nick.
Yeah, I think just in in comparison to Nick, for me and especially in this space, many of you will know, within MHFA, I class myself as a family member left behind. That's how I articulate it. And so when I first experienced suicide in many of its different forms 26 years ago, so a little bit longer than you, Chris, it was the language that was the most harmful. It was that what was being used and what was being told to describe something that had happened and the detrimental effect that it had on the family. It created such feelings of anger because how it was being described and the language that was being used was so shameful and so wrong But because that's what everybody was using, that's where this sense of anger came, to try and make sure that it was right and actually have an open conversation about it. And as we kind of explore for, you know, just under an hour together, and as I've revisited this feeling recently, as I've lost another family member, the change and the difference from 26 years ago to now, and how we speak about suicide, but how we support each other. And even from my own experience, what was in place in the workplace 26 years ago, or actually I should say 22 years ago, and what's in place now, and almost to a certain extent, how much further we still have to go, is still so relevant, still so important today. So absolutely, language is so key, because it's what sits with you, it's what stays with you, and it's also how you articulate that to everybody else, and how you give power to that. Because as hurtful and as harmful as some of these experiences are, there is still joy and celebration and education that comes from this topic. It isn't something that I view as so dark. So I think there's so much that language can do to actually bring more positivity to actually preventing suicide, which is what we're speaking about today.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Chloe. Just before we get on to the first question, just to say that I can see lots of you saying that the chat's disabled, and we are looking at how to enable it. So apologies that hasn't been there from the outset, but we are on it and trying to get that sorted. So just on language, Nick, if I can come back to you, what is suicide prevention?
So all the things that we do collectively, that's as individuals and as neighbours, as friends, that's a community. All the things that we do together, that we work together, that promote conditions to help people, well, to support people, to access help, to access the help that they need. So actually, suicide prevention is a collective term that's used for all those different things. That could be something as simple as when I open my door in the morning, saying good morning, how are you, to my next door neighbour, or stopping in the street and checking out if someone is actually okay. If I spot them in tears sitting outside a national bank in a street. Intervening, actually, intervention is a form of prevention. So there's a language that comes with suicide prevention that when we understand it, it makes perfect sense. But intervention is about caring enough to interfere, really. So interfering with someone else's life could save that person's life. It could be, and at work, when someone's quiet, if they're upset, if they're not themselves, it could just be taking the time to go across and check in and ask them if there's anything I can do to help today. So suicide prevention, to answer your question, it's that collective term that we use to describe all the different activities within a community, within a country, if you like. People working together to reduce the incidence of people dying by suicide. I hope that answers. That was quick.
It does answer, and I think it takes us neatly to the first audience poll, and then we'll move into thinking about suicide prevention in the workplace. So can I just ask you to each go, remember this is anonymous, so there's no right or wrong answer, but how confident do you feel talking about suicide in the workplace? If you could just put it in the poll, you should have a poll that's come up on your screen, which gives you the chance to put your answer. Okay. Can we see the results, Abby? So 30% confident, 55% somewhat confident, and 15% not confident at all. I think it's yeah, it's not surprising that those of you who've joined the webinar, perhaps I would say, have a higher level of confidence overall than perhaps the general population. So it's great to be able to see that there are so many of you who have that level of confidence, and we can always get more confidence. Chloe, I don't know if you want to reflect on the results from the poll.
Yeah, I think my I take a lot of it from my own experience, but also from, I guess, what I kind of do in community. And so I volunteer for UK Black Pride, I think, and the London LGBT Community Centre. I'm a director. And so when you are in community spaces that are really the most marginalised, if I'd done this poll maybe about through my own experiences, so 26 years ago, but maybe through my community work for the last 10, I would have said that I wasn't confident at all. Now I live in the very confident, because I feel to a certain extent that I kind of have no choice, being a family member left behind, to continue to help do my part to create a space where I don't continue to lose siblings, or I don't continue to lose people who are important, because of many and all of the points that Nick talked about. How do we usualize identity and inclusivity and individuality in life? How do we break down stigmas that stop people from being able to show up, but being able to celebrate themselves and live their lives as they wish to live their lives? And that really only comes from talking about it and utilizing it in the workplace, which is where we spend the majority of our time. You know, we see this and we talk about this with mental health, but with suicide in particular, it's the correlation between what impacts your life and then therefore the choices that people choose to make, and that they're one and the same, they're not separate. So actually, if you understand the barriers that stop people from being able to enjoy their lives, celebrate their lives and show up, that is prevention. And for me, that is in everything. If we are talking about people and how they can be their whole self, then they won't ever entertain thoughts of suicide, because they feel like they have a place and they feel like they belong and they feel like they can show up, but they also know that there are other people that they can go and speak to. So I feel like I'm much more confident, but I would be honest and say that the more that I experience suicide in all of its different forms, directly and indirectly, my confidence continues to be knocked, because you can't separate the pain. And so even though, you know, I talked about it with Simon, and I talked about it with Denise, with the Depression and Me video, which I think Simon was like 3-4 years ago. And my very first experience of suicide was my cousin when I was 18. So when I was 14 and he was 18, and that was 26 years ago. But I lost a beautiful, amazing person, and they were 23 and their name was Shay. And I think everything I thought I knew about suicide has completely changed, because you're so aware of trying to celebrate people and celebrate life and to see people and to try and usualize and do these things. And sometimes, no matter how much you do, no matter how confident you feel that you have spoken to someone, connected to someone, it's that difference of sometimes, for whatever reason, it's just not enough. And that's the part for me where the confidence gets knocked, because that's not a me, that's an individual thing, but it's to keep going and to keep pushing. Because for every one person that you do reach, and the ripple effect of that and what it can do, you know, that one person can reach hundreds and thousands more. And I don't want to take up too much time, but I remember 2 years ago, when they do the like Twitter year, and they do this whole like thread of, you know, this is how wonderful on New Year's Day it's been. And I was really struggling how to talk about my year. I'd been through some amazing things, but my mental health was not great. And there was this young Black gay guy on Twitter, And he said, you know, I've you know, tried to end my life a few times. And I'm not saying this message for pity. I'm saying to anybody out there who is struggling, I'm still here. And if you need any help or support, I'm here. Message me at any time. And I was so moved by it that I, you know, had to reply. And I was like, I see you. I think you're amazing. Such a wonderful, beautiful soul. And he said, no, thank you, because I've been following you. And by you talking about some of the things that you talk about has actually given me the strength to still be here. And so that ripple effect really hit home for me of just how me living me and being me and the power of that, what that can do for somebody else. And that someone wouldn't necessarily think that's suicide prevention, but that absolutely is. And so it's how we need to adapt our language to understand that nothing is siloed or separate. They are very much one and the same, but it's understanding the nuance and the tone of voice and how we adapt those words to understand it, all for the betterment of feeling free and feeling us.
Thanks very much, Chloe. And I think the really powerful thing there is we never know who's listening. We
Exactly.
never know who hears. But yeah, your point about seeing people and seeing people in all their diversity is a really important part of prevention. Nick, is there anything you'd like to add to that before we think about suicide prevention specifically in the workplace? You're on mute again.
Sorry, I'm just tingling because Chloe, everything you've just said there resonates so deeply. Our life experiences are who we are, and actually thinking about talking and confidence in the workplace. Simon's just said we never know who's listening, and I'm going to go back to how I started by talking about how it was 20 years ago in the workplace I was in then. Suicide prevention education, when a training intervention is put into a workplace, it directly affects culture. And some of what you've just shared, some of what we've been talking about, is included in essential training around this subject. But how confident are you? Do you feel talking about suicide in the workplace? I remember going on a program for the very first time in my life in a work context, and this was just after the millennium, where suicide prevention and indeed mental health were not talked about. And suddenly a program was being put on to talk about suicide. It was very confronting. And I remember going on the program and being enlightened. But did that immediately mean I was confident to talk about suicide? Would I have the confidence as a result of a day of learning to go and speak to someone possibly in distress in the workplace or in the street or in my family? Honestly, I have to answer, no, it wasn't as simple as just sticking a program on and expecting everything to change. Actually, it's through practice and again, tragically often more experience that behavior really changes. And it was a year, 2 years, I was teaching suicide prevention. Within a couple of years, it became part of my work. And it was only then that really some of the learning that I had heard began to be embedded so that my behavior would change. And as again, you touched on, Chloe, it gets to the stage with suicide prevention through life experience. People die for all sorts of reasons, but tragically, sometimes people die by suicide. It gets to a point with this subject, with this practice, that we have, I feel, no choice. If I see someone, hear someone, I become aware someone may be in distress, I haven't got a choice today. I have to make it my business And that involves often going across and just connecting and speaking and understanding what it is that's driving them to feel the way they're feeling, and possibly even think the way they're thinking. So this is something that grows, and it's something that grows with practice and awareness. There may be people here listening today that it's never crossed their mind this is something that we would even consider at work. Well, that's exactly where we were at 20 years ago in the UK. This is the UK. There were other countries back then that were way ahead of us. Fortunately, we've changed. So, yeah, no, I'm moved, and of course that movement that we get emotionally through talking about this subject, part of why we do what we do. So just thank you. Thanks for sharing.
While you've got your mic on, Nick, I'm going to just ask you talk to us a bit about what you think the role of workplaces is in suicide prevention, but also, Chloe, if you're not looking in the chat, just how much your words resonated with people. Have a look.
Sorry to interrupt. I am, and I want to follow Nick, because I think we're in perfect symmetry with each other, because I've seen a couple of bits that I want to pull back.
So Nick, talk to us about the role of workplaces in suicide prevention and why workplaces have to be thinking about this.
So this feels quite kind of simple for me, because there is no role. We're here to work. Imagine that, which is what I used to hear. It's not our business. If customers die, that's their lives. It's not our life. We do this. This is our role. We perform this service. We sell this product, and that's it. Everything else is their business. Our business, your business. No, is my answer to that, because the impacts, the responsibility, the costs, actually, if we wanted to get into raw money, which starts to feel ugly, but actually our colleagues are often our friends as well. We have professional friendships at work, and we love each other. And that means if someone disappears, if they go off work, we would be concerned. If someone doesn't come back to work because possibly they've died, that's going to change the workplace forever. That absence, that permanent absence, changes the workplace forever. It will change me forever if someone I'm working with was to die. If they die by suicide and I'm aware, maybe I've done a bit of training, maybe I've got a kind of general awareness of suicide prevention, or maybe I'm a specialist and I know it back to front. If someone dies and I look back on the months and the weeks and the days, sometimes the hours before that person died, and I realize I could have intervened, I could have helped, actually, I might have been able to prevent them from dying. That is going to have a huge impact on me. And this is the sort of life experience that we pick up through work. It could be a customer, a service user, beneficiary. I had these experiences years and years ago, and some of them injured me profoundly. And I can still remember them to this day. I can still remember people's names. And I can remember talking to management within organizations that I worked in about events where people had died. A service user, beneficiary had died, and I'd learnt about it through a telephone call when I tried to contact them, and I'd been told by a family member, "Haven't you heard? They're not here." No, I haven't heard. No one told me, and I've just found out now. Well, this applies. Avoiding this, preventing this, starts with caring. So to go to this question, what is the role of workplaces in suicide prevention, and why should they think? well, we should do everything we can in life to help each other stay alive. I think this is critical. So workplaces have a duty of care towards their employees, but I would suggest taking that further, very much a duty of care towards their customers, in whatever form those customers are. So why the costs for across the whole? We talk about the ripple effect. The ripple effect of someone dying by suicide goes on for years. Actually, suicide injuries, so the pain and injury that a workplace can experience through loss, sudden traumatic loss of a colleague or a customer, can change the entire can change the entire performance of a business. So okay, that's a little bit convoluted, but it's kind of big picture. I'm trying to throw that into 3-4 minutes. It's not complicated. I've probably made it complicated, but in very simple terms, it affects everybody, and that's why actually workplaces we spend most of our time at outside of the home. It's just as important at home, but workplaces, schools, places where we connect with each other, we have to be 100% aware that suicide's never that far away, and that actually the steps we can take to prevent people from dying.
Thanks, Nick. And I don't think that was convoluted at all. I think it was very comprehensive. And of course, one of the things that's happening in the chat as you speak is about the hybrid working. And so you just talked about the at home and out of home. So I just wanted to acknowledge that the complexity of that and the hybrid working, people being at home and being at work, and how we connect and read signals is obviously slightly more complex, and whilst it's worked for some people, it's also impacted negatively on some people. So we have a situation which has been going on for a couple of years now, but does create a new context for suicide prevention and the role of workplaces when we are working at home as well as online. Chloe, you said you wanted to follow Nick, so over to you.
I mean, the common denominator is people, right? Regardless of whether we're in the workplace, whether it's hybrid, we're people. And so what we also don't want to do is to put this huge responsibility on a workplace to help keep a person safe, right? It's how we can try and keep each other safe, whether that's your direct family, whether that's your line manager, it's the people that work underneath you, you're a CEO and it's an entire business. You know, how do we show up for people? You know, when I talked about the ripple effect, it can go both ways. But to Nick's point, you know, my first experience was at 14. And what happened was that my entire family flipped and didn't really know what to do. All the adults stopped adulting. I became an adult at 14 and held my family, and that put me on my backside 10 years later. And I had a full mental, physical, and emotional breakdown, and it still continues to do so at different moments, because it's not something that I'm totally healed from, nor will heal from as we continue to have other periods of suicide. But you know, what also impacts that so much, and I've read in, you know, comments in the chat where, you know, it's about the language that people refuse to use. So, you know, some people saying, I refuse to use the word suicide, or I say, you know, died by mental illness. And that's when we were talking about language. Language is so powerful. It means so much, but also sometimes the very harsh reality of why things happen are the worst things that we want to accept. And so I'm just going to give a very singular viewpoint. When my cousin died by suicide, that was his choice. It was the hardest thing for me to acknowledge, but that was his choice. And my job was to help the rest of my family understand, but also as I met other versions of him throughout my lifetime, how could I show other people that they had different choices, that there was more for them, and to not be so narrow viewed or to feel what was 26 years ago to where we are now. And one of the most fundamental things for that, in my experience, was my culture. Because in the Black community, especially in the Black African community, we don't talk, we don't talk about suicide. We don't even talk about mental health. Like, that's, it's a medicine you can take for that. Or, why do you need to, like, even I talk about it in this space, and my dad's saying, why do you need to go and talk to a stranger? Why can't you talk to me? And so that's why I say it's about utilizing all of these things. And you know what, sometimes I completely get it wrong, but I can't not talk about it. I can't not say it. And if I go into any workplace, that's me. And so when we go back to that full circle about people, we are always the sum of our experiences. We never know when someone is listening, but if we are connecting together with people, if we are being mindful of other people's space, like I said, I will give a trigger warning, caution warning before I share my story. But if I know, if I had had that 26 years ago, if I had had someone else help give me language that made what was going on in my head make sense, I would have been able to connect in so many different ways, and it would have benefited me so much more. And I say this as someone who is not ill. I say this often, I call myself a mental health survivor. I continue to survive. There's nothing wrong with me. I think I'm absolutely amazing. And so in that perspective, I can be honest and say, I have been to the depths to think about, what does suicide look like? Because of my experiences, I've never quite gone that road, but do I absolutely understand the journey and the path that it can take someone down? Absolutely. Am I going to judge someone because of those thoughts? No way in hell. And let's be really honest, after the last 2 years that we've just had, I would not say that there is not one person who's really gone to a dark place with their mental health after the last 2 years. And the one thing that we really have to learn to do with each other is to hold hands and say that that's okay. The more that we talk about the positive and the negative, this is where we are preventing, because there's this huge bubble of fear, and this huge bubble of fear that is unspoken. And in the workplace, as I actually said to my boss a few weeks ago, most people come to work to escape. They come to work to escape all the things that they got going on outside, and they just want to exist at work. And if at work you can't talk about some of the hardest things, then you're going to put yourself in an even worse position, because you're going to take all of that back home with you and feel like, how can I be surrounded by people and feel absolutely alone? And that's why we have to get back to people. We have to get back to trying to support each other, trying to talk about all of the different things. And when people feel like they can belong, they won't feel like suicide is their only choice, because they know that they have other choices. So it's about, how do we as a workplace build community and come together and try and look out for each other in the same way that you would look out for a family member. For the most part at work, you meet your friends for life. They're, godparents for your children. Sometimes you get married to a work colleague. Like, you can build the best of relationships in a workplace. So if we can't also experiment and test on how we build those relationships in a workplace and bring everything that will then benefit everything else that we do, then where else are we supposed to do that?
Thank you, Chloe. I think this moves us very neatly on to the sort of final question before we start looking in the Q&A and the chat. So, thinking very specifically, and if I can come back to you, Nick, I think, Chloe, what you've just said so powerfully is that workplaces are people. And where people are, we need to be able to celebrate the highs and hold hands through the lows, and that different things will impact people in different ways at different times. But if we could just, before we go into the last question, just find out about your own experiences. Do you think your workplaces are taking an active role in suicide prevention? And the poll should appear on your screen just now. Okay, hopefully everyone would have had a chance to press a button. So 18% yes, almost 60% saying partially we're learning and building awareness, and a quarter no, not active. So some things going on, some things to be optimistic about, but also lots of room to really develop that active role. So Nick, can you just talk about some of the things you think leaders and organisations can do to create those safer workplaces?
And culture change. 20 years as a generation, really. We have changed dramatically. Certain sectors have changed more than others. We see change in banking right now. We are in a financial crisis. We've got all sorts of different drivers for financial pain happening right now. Fortunately, the 4 big banks in the UK are all taking active steps to create a safer environment, not just for their employees, but very much for their customers. So there's culture change occurring in different sectors at different times. This does have to happen from the top down, because we've been doing it from the bottom up for a lot longer. But we have got now sector leaders saying this is unacceptable for various different reasons. One of the big reasons is money. And in banking, we begin to realize actually if a customer dies, we could be liable. Or also if an employee dies, we may very well be causing some of the stress that led to their death. So different sectors are beginning or now actively doing things to create environments where people can access help, to soften their processes, to have processes within an overall strategy that reflects their core values. And a core value might be no one that works for this company will die by suicide. That's a bold statement, but actually, if that's what we believe, no one, that's a zero suicide initiative. If a bank writes that through their policies, and that's actively then written into processes and procedures, at any point where someone may experience unbearable pain, there should be some form of suicide prevention action check put into place. And actually, that's a serious piece of work if you are a very complex business. That's an example I'm giving there. We could talk about the gambling. There's been an awful lot of work that's beginning in across the gambling sector, unfortunately led by tragedy. Well, okay, gambling operators are recognizing that they're being forced to in some parts, but there's responsibility from the gambling sector. Construction is one of the biggest sectors in the country that's affected by suicide. Culture, again, there's leadership here, it costs money to soften your approach to how you make money. and actually to put well-being at the heart of everything you do, so that if something does happen to an employee or to a customer, like losing your home 20 years ago, the finance company didn't care. They just wanted the keys. We just send the bailiffs round and give them the keys, and let's not have any bother. Just go and rent. It's not quite as simple as that, actually. Losing your home is a great example of unbearable pain. And that was my experience 20 years ago when that was the sector I worked in. So your question, culture change and how we lead that in positions of responsibility, it's our culture that we're leading. There's a pragmatic process that businesses, some of them are huge, are beginning to employ to soften and create alternatives, so different choices can be made, so different actions can be affected at different stages in business, which affects then, of course, the well-being of staff. I'm going to feel so much better going home knowing I did everything I could for that customer. And actually that customer communicated back to me, thank you for helping me get through this. It's not as bad as what I thought it was going to be. I feel better about that as an employee. This just keeps going, because it could be my colleague sitting across from me at my desk, I know is going through a very difficult breakup at home, is in financial difficulty, actually has got children that are having these experiences at school. There's an opportunity to support and help all the way through work performance and all the way through our contacts at work. So again, keeping this simple, no one should die by suicide, and no one should die by suicide as a result of our performance. And that can be our performance within the workplace or the way that we perform serving products to customers. So that's my simple answer. We can talk about this, but that's my simple answer.
Thanks, Nick. And I think what's so powerful about what you're saying here is it's about every bit that our work touches. It isn't just employees, it's the clients, the customers, the people we work with, and it's all of our responsibility. So yes, it has to be top down, but it is up to all of us to be better. And training helps, but it's obviously not the single answer. We know that people will also need support. So there's employee assistance programs and specific support that people need them bereaved by suicide. And I guess I'd just be keen to come back a bit. There's a conversation in the chat, and we haven't used the word stigma yet on this webinar specifically. I don't think, I may have missed it, but I don't think we've talked about stigma. So Chloe, I just wonder whether you wanted to kick off sort of what the impact of stigma is, and any thoughts that you have about, some people talked about taking your own life. Someone's just talked about man up from a gendered perspective. The way that we talk.
I've read, that suicide is not in some languages, in some marginalized, diverse languages. I mean, this is such a tricky one, because it always comes from your lived experience, and the stigma. Remember when I said before, it's a place of fear and not knowing and lack of education more often than not, which is where you started, Nick. I think it's also about being aware too, because a lot of the stigma around suicide is taught. It's not actually because it comes from a place of education. It's taught from, doctors who who will, you know, say, oh, we don't deal with that. We're not equipped to deal with that. And I can see that that's happened in the chat. It's come from, you know, people who want to understand more because they've unfortunately experienced such pain of loss of people in their lives that it's made them advocates for change to stop that happening. And so the stigma around you talking about it, what it does is it silences people. And that's the most honest thing that I can say, because that's my truth. It silenced me for 10 years because I wanted to have a space to celebrate my cousin. I wanted to talk about him. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to have joy. I wanted to, you know, have someone, you know, go through the whys and pick it all out for me and not try and tell me, Chloe, shush, be quiet. Or, you know, we can't talk about that now, or it's too painful. And so what it did was it, for me anyway, and I try and pay that forward, but I felt like I wasted 10 years that I could have done more, that I actually could have channeled that into something better and honored his memory. Because for me, that is honoring his memory. If he was beside me, could I be doing something positive based on what's come out of this pain and this drive that so many of us who are family members left behind, that's what we want to do. We want to channel into positivity so that no one else ever goes through what we're experiencing. So we have to be very careful when we are applying stigma to these things, because what we're doing is we're amplifying our fear and potentially stopping somebody else from being able to get connected to the support and the help that they need based on our individual thought and not the collective. That's your own journey, but that's why I say it's a people thing, because when you think about people and you recognize, and I think the one thing that we miss from this now that I'm talking is to be aware, because, you know, even when we think about where we're at right now, every single person on this line is going to be impacted by our energy, and every single person that's going to have a knock-on effect. And the subject around suicide is going to be so prevalent as we go into winter, that awareness, that self-awareness, and how we talk about it in the workplace, but how we make space for it might actually just be the change for someone else who's feeling like, I'm going to be so lost, so stuck, that actually I'm going to go down routes and avenues that I might never have. Because someone put a comment, and I can't remember who it was, but they said a really important word, you know, when we talked about choice, but someone says that at a lot of time, it's crisis. It's crisis, that someone is pushed to the very edge and they're in a crisis. And that's sometimes where decisions are made. When we know that people are going to be impacted by fundamental crises that affect so many people, it's what can we do individually, but collectively as workplaces to make it safer. And it is actually to talk about it.
Thank you, Chloe. That's you're really powerful. And Nick, can I just ask you to pick up specifically on men and mental health? There's a lot of conversation in the chat about men not talking and men not opening up, and I just wonder whether you would have some thoughts in relation to that.
I never mention celebrities in my work. I don't ever identify individuals to talk and contextualize this subject. I don't want to trigger people and don't want to mention people, know people personally, but I can talk about myself and leadership in talking about thoughts and feelings. I identify as male. I've been an alpha male at some points in my life, and actually I'm able to talk about suicide every day, and I do. So I think leadership and role modeling and some of the personalities that in the last few years have spoken out, and they remain nameless, and we're talking about men this minute, have been hugely helpful. Men culturally don't talk about their feelings. We've talked about this for years. We're shut down, we're trained, we learn not to talk. One of the things that I wanted to say before we close is the language, just going back to some of what Chloe's been touching on. Suicide's all around us. Yeah, suicide is a human behavior. It always has been. It's nothing new. But we talk, and you hear people talk in terms with language that's unhelpful. And I want to just give a heads up around some of that language right now. Warning signs. When you use that word warning, oh, he's a man, you know, he's not talking and he's isolating and I haven't heard from him. Okay, these are signs. They're signs of something. But this, and it's an example of language warning. I'm getting scared. When you start warning me, I'm getting scared. Just as like I should be scared when I'm walking somewhere that's dangerous. It's great, there's signs up telling me this is a dangerous place. Actually, with suicide, an awful lot of us think about suicide in our lives. Some of us will go on to do behavior as a result of those thoughts. But by comparison to the numbers of people thinking and the number of people that do behavior, very few people actually die. And that's the reality. So thinking about men and well, they don't talk, we do talk actually, when you create the conditions for me to talk. But creating the conditions for anything involve openness and the language here. I've stopped talking about warning signs around suicide for years and years and years because I don't want to scare you. Actually, it's all right to talk about suicide. Talking about suicide allows people to unpack and actually, so language, just going back to it, there's one heads up for one word that we can take out of this conversation. You don't need to warn me about it. No, actually, what I need to know is that it's all right to talk, and that starts with clean language. So same with men. It's all right to talk about suicide, and well, we're doing it right now.
Nick, thank you. I'm really conscious of time and that people are going to have to be jumping off for their next Teams call in a moment, or the next Zoom call. And I just wanted to end really by saying, you know, none of us were born not able to talk about mental health and suicide. We often learn what we're allowed to talk about and not allowed to talk about, but we can, through training and through practice and giving it a go and not staying silent, get better and create that ripple effect which Chloe talked about. The suicide first aid training was life-changing for me when Nick delivered it a few years ago, and I wish I'd had it at least 20 years before. They might well have made a difference to some people's lives at that point, but didn't. So I would recommend you having a look and thinking about that. We will be sending out the slides. We will do that with the recording, and there are some resources and stats in there. And I guess I just want to say two things really. You know, we know that things are not easy for a lot of people at the moment. So it is important for us to be hyper aware and hyper vigilant. And if we are worried, to talk about it to the people we're worried about. Start the conversation and see what happens. But there's also a lot to be optimistic about, that so many of you joined this call, that mental health and well-being is talked about so much more than it was in workplaces, and that we've got a lot to build on, and we know that there is not one right answer. But thank you for all you're doing. Thank you for being people who will take a deep breath, who will ask the questions, who will try to create safer and better workplaces where everybody feels like they belong. We look forward to continuing the conversation. Chloe, Nick, you've been amazing panelists. Thank you so much for sharing so openly and honestly, and have a good day, people. Take care.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.